Dieses Video wird dir präsentiert von helden.de, deinem zuverlässigen Partner für Fahrrad- und E-Bike-Versicherungen. Mit dem Heldencode aus der Videobeschreibung sparst du zusätzlich noch den ersten Monatsbeitrag und unterstützt dadurch diesen Kanal Fahrradstadt Hamburg.
Perfect. It's still North America, but that's about it. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to
Genau, da sind wir ausgestiegen letztes Mal.
talk about some pretty major shortcomings I found during my time in Montreal. Things I haven't really seen mentioned in any other urbanist content. So if you don't want to shatter your rosy image of Montreal, you can pretend that the video is done right now. I'd like to thank my supporters on Nebula and Patreon for finding...
Okay, da hätte ich ja noch da 5 Minuten weiter gucken können. Oder 5 Sekunden weiter gucken können, dann hätten wir hier gut aussteigen können. Ich bin zu früh ausgestiegen. Mist. So ein Mist aber auch.
Financing my fantastic trip to the best city in North America. You guys are the best. Have a great day. Okay, I think they're gone. Let's get
Ich liebe seinen Humor. Sein Humor ist genau mein Ding.
real. First, some context. Montreal is on an island, but that island is chopped up by highways, and some of these highways cut right through the center of the city. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with highways. They're a
Oh, die Autobahn.
great way to move vehicles from point A to point B quickly and efficiently.
Aber eben nicht durch Städte. Da hätte er mir vielleicht die Autobahn in Berlin zeigen sollen. Dann hätte er gewusst, dass wir so einen Irrsinn auch haben.
When highways are used correctly, they divert traffic away from city streets and onto the highway. But highways should go around cities, not through them. And the problems come when highways are used to funnel tens of thousands of cars onto city streets.
Erinnert ihr euch an das Video, was wir geguckt haben über den Umbau, als wir gelernt haben, dass, war das Nürnberg? Nürnberg war das, ne? War das Nürnberg? Ich glaube, Nürnberg war das gewesen, die auf diese grandiose Idee gekommen sind, jetzt sich nochmal eine Stadtautobahn zu leisten, weil im Grunde ist es ja nichts anderes als eine Stadtautobahn, was die da planen. Eigentlich hätte man gelernt haben sollen in der Zwischenzeit, dass wir keine Stadtautobahn brauchen. Ja, genau, den Frankenschnellweg. Genau, als ich noch dachte, das geht um einen Fahrradschnellweg, bis ich gemerkt habe, dass wir ja gar nicht über Fahrradschnellwege reden, sondern dass wir über eine Stadtautobahn reden. Hätte ich gar nicht gedacht. Also da war ich ganz irritiert oder ganz schockiert, als ich festgestellt hatte, es geht hier gar nicht um Fahrräder, sondern es geht um eine Stadtautobahn. Total rückwärtsgewandt. Also da kannst du ja nicht nur, naja, gut. Aber er sagt es auch, keine Stadtautobahn. Stadtautobahn schlecht. Stadtautobahn böse.
And that is exactly the way highways are misused in Montreal. There were so many places where I found car sewers connected to highways. This highway even has its own backup highway next to it. This was one thing I really noticed about Montreal, especially when cycling. There are highways everywhere. In some places, they try to make it as safe as possible for people cycling, which is great. But it still amazed me just how much land on this island is dedicated to highways and related infrastructure. These highways were built in the 1950s and 1960s when elevated expressways were all the rage. But now they're crumbling and nobody wants to pay the billions of dollars required to repair them.
Ja, und da sind wir wieder. Da schließt sich der Kreis zu dem Video, was wir eben geguckt haben. Solche Infrastruktur ist ultra teuer im Maintenance, also jetzt fehlen mir die deutschen Wörter. Furchtbar. In der Reparatur und in der Instandhaltung und in der Wartung sind die unglaublich teuer und irgendwann, wie jetzt zum Beispiel 50, 60 Jahre später, sind die so marode, dass man sie eigentlich erneuern muss. Aber wer kann und will, er auch kann, das Ding mit komplett neu ersetzen? Wer kann das abreißen und neu bauen? Ne? Also, oder wer kann da diese Baumaßnahmen durchführen, die so teuer sind auf so einer langen Strecke? Das kann sich doch niemand leisten. Teure Infrastruktur sorgt für teuren Unterhalt. Herzlich willkommen.
Historically, Montreal was an island of streetcars. Look, there were so many lines that they overflowed outside of the map. This means that a large part of the island is one big streetcar suburb, with medium-density mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. Of course, all of these streetcar tracks were torn out to build car infrastructure in the 1950s and 60s, and this is the source of most of the problems with Montreal today. Streetcars, or what sane countries call trams, are extremely efficient for urban transportation. When you remove streetcars from a street and turn the street over to only cars, you significantly reduce the capacity of the street.
Ja.
So if you had a lane that could move over 5,000 people per hour by streetcar, you now have a lane that can only move around 1,000 or 2,000 people by car. So what was once a human-sized, slow-speed, walkable street with streetcars becomes a strode for high-speed car traffic, with the only public transit being buses that get stuck in traffic.
Herzlich willkommen.
Instead
Und in diese Busse setzt sich da auch niemand rein. Also wenn ich in einen Bus reinsetze, der im Stau steht, stundenlang und ich da zu Fuß wahrscheinlich schneller vorbeilaufen kann, sorry, aber dann nehme ich den Bus auch nicht. Und dann habe ich den Effekt, den ich durch einen guten ÖPNV hätte, habe ich natürlich komplett ruiniert.
of limiting streets to only local traffic and forcing through traffic to the many, many highways, Montreal makes basically everything a through street. I did find a few modal filters around Montreal like this one, and this one that prevents through traffic, but these were rare and the vast majority of residential streets were through routes for cars.
Ja, auch eine deutsche Eigenheit. Wir reagieren ja auch allergisch dagegen, wenn wir darüber nachdenken sollen, Modalfilter einzuführen oder die irgendwo hinzusetzen. Da kriegen wir gleich, also ich nicht, aber dann kriegen viele Deutsche gleich irgendwie Hasspickel, weil denen ja die Freiheit genommen wird, dann da mit dem Auto durchzufahren. Und das kann ja nicht sein, dann muss ich ja einen Umweg fahren. Ja, du kannst auch einfach anders dich bewegen. Wir schaffen es einfach nicht. Ja, und da sind wir auch nicht besser als Montreal in dem Moment. Auch wir müssen um jeden Modalfilter irgendwie kämpfen und es gibt immer 48.000 Gründe, warum es hier keinen Modalfilter geben kann. Und die Polizei ist da in Hamburg immer sehr vorne mit dabei bei der Argumentation. Ja, wichtig. Modalfilter. Wichtig. Sage ich immer wieder.
This makes these streets a major source of car traffic. What's even worse is that they make many of these streets multi-lane one-way streets. Multi-lane, one-way streets are terrible for cities. They are used in order to speed up car traffic, which is exactly the opposite of what you want for livable neighborhoods. A one-way road like this should not exist downtown. And although the bike lane is well designed, there's nothing on the other side, so this guy is cycling on the sidewalk. These one-way streets are also more dangerous to cross because there can't be pedestrian islands. These exist only because the speed of car traffic is more important than the safety of people walking. In some places,
Moin Paul, hallo Paul, herzlich willkommen, gar kein Problem. Setz dich hin, mach's dir bequem, höre zu, von mir aus auch, mach gerne mit, wir hören dir gerne zu, lass dir Zeit. Herzlich willkommen hier im Stream.
Montreal has been slowly improving some of these strody former streetcar streets, which is an improvement, of course. But a lot of these problems would be solved if they cut off through traffic, push cars to the highway network, and put the streetcars back.
Ja, und das ist genau das, was wir diskutieren, oder wo wir in Hamburg ja auch diskutieren. Wir haben ja die Rohdigallee, wir haben auch schon häufiger darüber gesprochen, über den Umbau, der jetzt geplant ist, wo parallel eine Autobahn ist. Ja, also wir haben eine Wohnstraße, die aktuell vierspurig ist. Vierspurig. Ja, vierspurig plus, ja, vierspurig, ist vierspurig. Und eigentlich nur als Durchgangsstraße benutzt wird, um von den Außengebieten wie Sasel zum Beispiel, die nicht mehr zu Hamburg gehören, in die Stadt reinzufahren, weil sie nicht in der Lage sind, auf die Autobahn zu fahren, die direkt in die Stadt reinführt und also dann endet. Und jetzt soll die umgebaut werden. Man will einen Fahrstreifen wegnehmen insgesamt, aus 4 3 machen, wovon aber einer der 3 Fahrstreifen dann eine Busspur ist, also sozusagen 2 Fahrstreifen für den motorisierten Individualverkehr und einen dritten Fahrstreifen, der nur für Busse ist, weil sehr viele Busse dort fahren. Und jetzt gehen alle auf die Barrikaden, weil sie sagen, um Gottes Willen, nein, wir werden unseren Freiheit beschränkt und jetzt kann man nicht mehr durchfahren. Digga, dann nimm doch die Autobahn, die da parallel führt. Ganz ehrlich, Christus nicht gebacken, dann die Autobahn zu nehmen, die einfach parallel dazu führt irgendwie. Da musst du halt nur einmal links abbiegen, einmal rechts abbiegen auf die Autobahn und dann kannst du ja in die Stadt reinfahren. Wir kriegen es ja auch nicht hin.
However, that is an extremely tough sell politically when there's been decades and decades of car-centric development. Plus, there won't be any money left after spending billions on propping up outdated highways anyway.
Ja.
Right now, Montreal is missing out on one of the biggest benefits of good quality surface transit as a walking accelerator. a way to get from one walkable area to another walkable area quickly and efficiently. This really helps to connect walkable areas and makes them more accessible. Transit in Montreal is heavily focused on long-distance travel, where stations are far apart and either underground like the metro or elevated like the REM.
Wie viele Autos auf der Rodigallee fahren? Das können wir bestimmt mal gucken. Warte. Rodigallee. Jetzt muss ich die erstmal suchen hier. Da, Rodigallee. Auch hier nochmal der Hinweis übrigens, wer sich für Bauprojekte, Infrastrukturprojekte in Hamburg interessiert oder wer aus Hamburg ist und gerne was wissen möchte darüber, guckt gerne auf veloroute.hamburg vorbei. Da gibt es zu allen Baumaßnahmen in ganz Hamburg, hier sind alle Radrouten und auch alle Baumaßnahmen sind hier hinterlegt. Da kann man entsprechend dann draufklicken hier, sieht dann einen Ist-Zustand, wie die Planung ist, wie seine eigene Meinung ist und hat dann auch gleich nochmal passend dazu, und das finde ich bei ihm fantastisch, hat dann auch nochmal den Lageplan, Erläuterungsbericht und so weiter und so fort. Immer mit dabei, verlinkt, und das ist dann wirklich immer sehr praktisch, muss man sagen. Und dadurch kann man dann entsprechend Rodigallee, Weiterentwicklung. Okay, das wollten wir jetzt nicht. Wir wollten den da. Erläuterungsplan. So, und da haben wir doch auch mit Sicherheit hier Verkehrsbelastung. 2019 Verkehrszählung, jährliche Zählstelle. Aus den Zählungen werden für einzelne Querschnitte folgende Belastungen ermittelt. Ja gut, das sind dann 3 Teilabschnitte. Man kann sagen, ja, also die 20.000, die Recht meint, das kommt ganz gut hin. Kommt auf an, wo. Aber man kann schon sagen, also insgesamt 20.000 ist eine gute Schätzung. Also als Mittelwert zu nehmen, 20.000 ist eigentlich eine gute Schätzung. Aber das Ding ist ja, von den 20.000 Autos sind wahrscheinlich 19.500 sind wahrscheinlich Durchgangsverkehr und 500, die überhaupt irgendwas in dieser Straße machen wollen. Und diese 19.500, die dort entlangfahren, die könnten gerne auch woanders entlangfahren. Nämlich Maps, Rodigallee. So, dieses hier, das ist die. Hier haben wir die Rodigallee, um die geht das, ja, und die ist Durchgangsverkehr von den Randgebieten, also von den nicht zu Hamburg gehörenden Teilen wie Barsbüttel, Stapelfeld, Glinde zum Teil auch, manchmal, warum auch immer, die entsprechend dann hauptsächlich auch Barsbüttel, die dann hier über die Rodigallee entsprechend in die Stadt fahren. So. Und parallel dazu, etwas südlich, gibt es die A24, ja, die man auch gut nutzen kann. Und die dann sozusagen in den Horner Kreisel entsprechend endet. Aber man muss ja weiterhin über die Rodigallee fahren. Und wenn man das sich mal so anguckt, wie die Straße aussieht, ja, herzlich willkommen. Und die Radwege sind eher so mäh, würde ich behaupten. Ne? Äh, 20.000 pro Tag. Am Tag, nicht pro Stunde, um Gottes Willen. Um Gottes Willen. Nee, 20.000 am Tag. Man sieht hier auch nochmal, ne, hier hat man nochmal die maximalen Stundenwerte sozusagen. Hier waren in der maximalen Stunde 1800 Autos in der Stunde um 7:45 Uhr, hier um 1500 und hier 1880 also, ne, das sind sieht man auch, dass dass es der Pendelverkehr ist, rein und raus. Ne? Entsprechend. Genau. Und wie gesagt, die Straße will man jetzt umbauen. Und hat es verstanden eigentlich, also die Behörde hat es verstanden, unser Verkehrssenator hat es verstanden und die Behörde für Verkehr und Mobilitätswende hat es verstanden, dass wir dort die Autos wegmachen, also wegdrücken müssen. Wir müssen sie auf die Autobahn drücken. Die sollen auf der Autobahn fahren und nicht durch die Stadt durchfahren. Aber dann kommen die NIMBYs wieder, also die Not in my Backyards Leute, die kommen dann wieder und sagen von wegen, ja, aber, also bloß nicht. Ne? Jetzt habe ich schon so viele Tabs hier offen, dass ich schon gar nicht mehr weiß, wo ich eigentlich bin.
This makes short trips unnecessarily long because you have to go all the way down to the metro and all the way back up again just to get to your destination. Trams are much more convenient for short trips, and they are the ideal walking accelerator, but that's a topic for a future video. I found the surface transit in Montreal to be pretty poor. There are no trams anymore, and the buses are slow. Schedules are very unreliable because buses are often stuck in traffic and stuck at red lights. Like, why does this bus with dozens of people on it need to wait at this red light at all? And the backwards ticketing system means that dwell times, the time that transit vehicles spend at a stop, are way too long. It is insane how long this bus had to stop here to board 4 people. This made it very annoying for me to explore Montreal's great walkable neighborhoods on foot. I couldn't get from one area to another without waiting ages for a bus that would crawl along at a pace barely faster than walking. Now, it felt to me like the Bixi bike share is being used to fill the gap as a walking accelerator and to make up for poor surface transit. Unfortunately, bike share is an inferior replacement to good surface transit. A tram can take anyone, but bike share isn't useful if you can't cycle because you're carrying a bunch of things, traveling with children, or for any number of other reasons. Bike share is a cute idea when a small percentage of your population rides a bike as an easy way to get more people to cycle. But it just doesn't work when the majority of people ride bicycles. There's a reason why Amsterdam banned bike share back in 2017 and is only now reintroducing them in a very limited way, despite it being the first city in the world to introduce the concept of bike share back in 1965 and having a docked system back in 1999. I cannot tell you how many times I was exhausted from walking in Montreal and found the nearest Bixi docks completely empty, because in order to function, bike share needs a complex system of trucks that redistribute the bikes during the day, and this just becomes more and more difficult as the system grows. This is just not a scalable solution for mass transportation. The destruction of
Also ich muss sagen, für Hamburg, ich habe jetzt gerade überlegt, deshalb war ich etwas irritiert. Für Hamburg habe ich gerade überlegt, ob ich jemals sowas gesehen habe, dass Fahrräder von einer Station zur nächsten gebracht werden. Ist mir nie aufgefallen. Nee. Habe ich noch nie gesehen. Ich weiß nicht, ob das gemacht wird. Vielleicht jemand im Chat, der mehr darüber weiß, aber habe ich zumindest nie gesehen, dass in Hamburg die Stadträder umverteilt werden. Eigentlich sind immer überall eigentlich immer welche da. Also, ich kann ja mal kurz gucken hier. Ich bin der Meinung, dass die eigentlich immer sehr gut verteilt sind. Nö, also eigentlich sind überall in meiner Nachbarschaft ein Fahrrad, 3 Fahrräder, 6 Fahrräder, 4 Fahrräder, 18 Fahrräder, 4 Fahrräder, 5, 3, 10, 10, 25, 1, 6, 3, 1, 4, 14. Nö. Eigentlich sind in allen, also in den zu fußläufig erreichbaren Stadtradstationen, die ich innerhalb von 15 Minuten zu Fuß erreichen kann, sind überall ausreichend. Überall ausreichend Fahrräder. Also, vielleicht, keine Ahnung. Weiß ich nicht, müsste man mal anfragen bei Stadtrat, irgendwie, ob die das machen, ob das jetzt oft vorkommt, aber ist mir persönlich im alltäglichen Gebrauch nicht aufgefallen. Ich hatte zwar schon mal Reparaturfahrzeuge gesehen, ja, aber dass jetzt irgendwie Fahrräder auf- und umgeladen werden, habe ich nie gesehen.
The streetcar network explains another major problem with Montreal. When you exit many of the metro stations, you're dumped out of the side of an absolutely terrible strode. But this makes sense when you understand that these stroads were all streetcar streets. When the metro was built, they tore up the streetcars and handed all the space over to cars. So the area immediately outside of many metro stations is one of the most inhospitable streets in the whole neighborhood.
Ja,
Again, the valuable land surrounding a train.
Normalerweise würdest du ja aus der Subway-Station, aus der U-Bahn-Station rauskommen, würdest dich dann an die Tramstation, an die Straßenbahnstation stellen und würdest dann ja weiterfahren. So, die Möglichkeiten hast du ja aber da nicht mehr, weil das nicht mehr existiert. So, man steht dann direkt, man kommt raus und steht dann direkt vor einer vierspurigen Hauptstraße und sagt sich, ja, ist schön hier. Ja, hier fühle ich mich wohl.
Transit stop is squandered in favor of wide roads and parking lots.
Ja.
Some of these locations are absurd, like here, where you're literally dropped off at the side of a highway entrance. Like, come on, seriously? This is an insult to transit riders. I stayed at a hotel in the heart of Plateau, Montréal, what is considered by most to have the best urbanism in the whole city. So when I got off the metro, I was expecting some world-class urbanism. But when I exited the station, I saw this. I didn't even know what to make of this. It's like the middle of the street has been dug out to save drivers a few seconds of travel time. And to be crystal clear, this is not some far-flung suburb. This is what you see literally as soon as you exit one of the major metro stations in the plateau. The neighborhood that literally everyone told me I had to visit.
Ja, da wäre ich, ja, hätte ich mich umgedreht und wäre schnell wieder in die U-Bahn-Station reingegangen und wäre mit der U-Bahn ein bisschen weitergefahren wahrscheinlich. Ja, das ist doch lebenswert. Und dann stell dir mal vor, ja, wohnst da und sitzt auf dem Balkon und dann guckst du hier drauf. Das ist dein Blick vom Balkon. Lebenswert.
Amsterdam has this one area bulldozed in the 1960s with a similar issue, though the road and bike paths have a much safer design, of course. And I have complained about this road in multiple videos. But I also made a video about how Amsterdam is trying to fix this. As far as I can tell, Montreal has no plans to change any of this. I want you to understand that this is as much bad urbanism as this is good urbanism. But there are dozens of videos and articles about this, while nobody mentions this despite it being only a few blocks away. Now, to be fair, if I had exited at Montréal station instead, I would have been right in the middle of the most popular pedestrianized street. What a difference one metro stop makes. If there's one thing I learned about Montreal, it's that good urbanism drops off really fast. By North American standards, Montreal is building some great quality bicycle infrastructure, and after riding for a few hours with Stefan, I started feeling pretty good about riding a bike here. But once I started venturing out on my own, I realized just how fractured the network is. And because I didn't.
Ja, ist ja klar, wenn du mit dem durch die Stadt fährst, der dir ja die guten Seiten und schönen Seiten zeigen will, wirst du natürlich nicht die Sachen sehen, die du erlebst, wenn du alleine durch die Gegend fährst. Das ist ja klar. Wenn ich Agnes, unseren Verkehrssenator, fragen würde, ob er mir ob er mir zeigt, was Hamburg an Infrastrukturpläne hat, dann wird er mir ja auch nur die Prestigeobjekte zeigen und das, wo was vorangeht. Und er wird mir ja nicht die Horrorstraßen zeigen, die wir noch haben. Die Rodigallee würde er mir zum Beispiel mit Sicherheit nicht zeigen, als gutes Beispiel. Ja, da musst du dich am Lenker festkrallen, damit du nicht vom Fahrrad fällst beim Fahren.
know what routes were safe, I ended up in a lot of places where it felt dangerous to cycle. You might have a bike lane like this, but then the only infrastructure becomes this one path, which turns into a very narrow shared sidewalk next to high-speed traffic, and next thing you know, you're expected to navigate these insane suburban intersections on your bike. Now, to be fair to Montreal, this is to be expected in any city that is recovering from being bulldozed for car infrastructure, but I was still surprised just how much of a difference there was from borough to borough. It became very clear that Montreal is building bike infrastructure not so much where it is needed, but rather where it is politically acceptable to build. This leads to some very strange infrastructure choices. Like, there will be very high quality bicycle paths along pretty minor residential streets, but then like absolutely nothing on major dangerous roads. This was very strange to me because, for example, in the Netherlands or Denmark, small residential streets usually have no bicycle infrastructure at all because they're quiet residential streets with 30km/h speed limits and minimal car traffic, while the expensive protected bike lanes are reserved for major roads with more cars and higher speed limits. Part of the problem is that almost all residential streets in Montreal are through streets, so they have a lot of car traffic, as I mentioned earlier. And most residential streets are very wide with no traffic calming. I found only a few streets with speed bumps. Though I did find this pretty wacky street narrowing with flexi posts which slowed cars extremely well. This really shows you just how much drivers slow down when the street is narrowed.
Ja.
But for the most part, residential streets had very high vehicle speeds, which is why the city needs to overbuild the bicycle infrastructure in order to be safe, even on streets like this. But it means that the cycling budget gets spread very thin and there's no money or political will to build anything on the major roads. For example, I needed to cycle down this Strode, but I didn't because it was too dangerous.
Würde ich auch nicht machen. Ich bin auch nicht lebensmüde. Da würde ich auch nicht fahren, 100%ig nicht. Niemand würde mich dort aufs Fahrrad kriegen. Um Gottes Willen. Ja.
But just one block over was this protected bike lane on a tiny residential street. So it's good that I was able to cycle here, but this isn't where I wanted to be, right? I had to take these kind of detours regularly when trying to get anywhere, and it was very frustrating. Of course, the problem with cycling on smaller streets in North America is the ridiculous number of stop signs. Sorry, I mean arrêt signs.
Nochmal zurück zu dem Thema, was wir jetzt gerade hatten.
Frustrating. These kind of detours regularly when trying to get anywhere, and it was very frustrating.
Das machen wir in Hamburg leider auch und die Radrouten sind so angelegt, dass sie durch eben auch solche durch Seitenstraßen führen, die wo du Umwege fahren musst, durch Seitenstraßen, durch 30er-Zonen, durch 50er-Zonen mit jeweils einem Fahrstreifen, weil man sich nicht traut oder nicht möchte, dass man den direkten Weg an der Hauptstraße entlang macht, sondern man schiebt den Radverkehr dann durch Straßen ab, die dann sicherer sind. Aber am Endeffekt verlängert es natürlich den Radweg, den Weg, den du zurücklegen musst, wenn du durch 48 Seitenstraßen fahren musst und die Straße, auf der du eigentlich nur geradeaus fahren hättest müssen, irgendwie 12 Mal kreuzt, weil du jedes Mal an welchen Seitenstraßen entlang geführt wirst. Das gleiche Problem haben wir hier in Hamburg auch. Unsere Velorouten sind auch so angelegt. Ja. Weg von den direkten Hauptstraßen hin durch Schlängeltouren durch Tempo-30-Zonen.
One block over was this protected bike lane on a tiny residential street. So it's good that I was able to cycle here, but this isn't where I wanted to be, right? I had to take these kind of detours regularly when trying to get anywhere, and it was very frustrating. Of course, the problem with cycling on smaller streets in North America is the ridiculous number of stop signs. Sorry, I mean arrêt signs. Thankfully, Montreal cyclists ignore stop signs, which they should because stop signs are stupid and should not be used in this way, as I've talked about in a previous video. But of course, this is technically illegal, and it means that any bored cop looking to fill his quota can ticket you for it at any time. I also noticed that a lot of the protected bike paths in Montreal were two-way. These are sometimes called bi-directional bike lanes. There's a reason why traffic engineers do this, because putting the bike lanes together lets them get a little bit of extra space for bikes without taking space away from cars. And on multi-lane one-way streets, car lanes can be slightly closer together, which also leaves a few extra centimeters to make bike lanes wider, again, without taking space away from cars. But these kind of lanes can be dangerous in certain situations and probably should not be used on a street like this. Bidirectional cycling paths are not recommended.
Ja, da stimme ich dir zu. 10% Umweg für eine angenehmere Umgebung. Aber wenn dann die angenehmere Umgebung darin besteht, dass du durch eine Tempo-30-Zone geführt wirst, wo dann einseitig das Parken am Fahrbahnrand erlaubt ist und dass du eigentlich Angst haben musst die ganze Zeit bei entgegenkommendem Verkehr, obwohl du eigentlich derjenige oder diejenige bist, die Person, die eigentlich Vorrang hat und du jedes Mal Angst haben musst, dass dir die Person, die dem Auto entgegenkommt, dich umnietet, weil sie zu faul ist, in eine Lücke reinzufahren oder ähnliches, dann ist auch diese Tempo-30-Zone, durch die du dann geleitet wirst, eben auch nicht bequem und sicher, sondern sie ist alles andere, sondern sie macht eher Stress. Und das hast du in vielen der Hamburger Radrouten so, dass die durch diese 30er-Zonen und anwohnenden Straßen geführt werden, wo du aber ja leider, wo sie sich aber dann nicht trauen, dann entsprechend das Fahrbahnparken zu verbieten, sodass du dann jederzeit durchfahren kannst, sondern sie argumentieren dann ja, dass es ja sicherer ist, weil durch die am Fahrbahnrand stehenden Autos die Leute ja langsamer fahren würden. Aber das Einzige, was ich jedes Mal erlebe, ist, dass ich geschnitten werde, dass mir Leute entgegenkommen und nicht ausweichen, dass ich gucken muss, wie ich irgendwie klarkomme, und das verursacht Stress. Und dadurch habe ich einen längeren Weg, der auch noch gefährlich ist und Stress verursacht. Und dann wundert man sich, dass diese Radrouten eigentlich nicht so wahrgenommen werden, wie sie eigentlich gedacht sind. Komisch. Ganz merkwürdig.
Recommended on streets with a lot of cross streets and driveways, as drivers are not expecting to look for traffic coming from the opposite direction. This relatively minor intersection in Toronto is one of the most dangerous for cyclists in the whole city for exactly this reason. This bidirectional path near the waterfront in Montreal has long stretches between cross streets, and this is a reasonable design, though it does suddenly end with a walk your bike sign. And this bidirectional path was recently removed and replaced with wider one-way bicycle paths on either side of the road, which is a safer long-term solution. I definitely felt like there were way too many cross streets on most of these two-way cycling paths though, and without any protected intersections, of course. In some cases, Montreal mitigates the danger of lots of cross streets by having a stoplight at every intersection, which is really annoying. I ran into so many red lights when cycling in Montreal, which made cycling very slow. But I generally prefer taking transit over cycling anyway, and while I was checking out the new REM trains, I met up with these two guys who were in town doing the same thing. Bunch of transit-loving weirdos. But beyond that, there were 3 people I planned to meet up with in advance. 2 in Montreal proper, and 1 up here in Val-David. All 3 of these places were difficult or impossible to reach by public transit, even the 2 that are officially part of the city. These 2 may become more accessible when the full REM system is completed, though. But like all Canadian cities, it would definitely be a compromise to live in Montreal without owning a car. Intercity train service is very limited, and even going to Toronto, Canada's largest city, there are only 6 trains per day. Not per hour, per day. At least they do have commute in Montreal, though. But like all Canadian cities, it would definitely be a compromise to live in Montreal without owning a car. Intercity train service is very limited, and even going to Toronto, Canada's largest city, there are only 6 trains per day. Not per hour, per...
Ja, und das ist natürlich... Und dann wundert man sich, ja, das nutzt ja keiner. Wir bieten das doch an, aber da sitzt ja keiner drin. Ja, wie auch, wenn du es in deinen Tagesalltag nicht integrieren kannst, weil du 4 Stunden hier Zeit hast zwischen den beiden Zügen, das sind 4 Stunden Luft. Was ist, wenn ich um 20 Uhr ankommen muss? Ja, wer nimmt einen Zug 2 Stunden früher? Keiner. Niemand. Ich würde nicht mal den Zug nehmen, wenn es 90 Minuten früher da wäre, dann würde ich den Zug auch nicht in Betracht ziehen, dann würde ich auch anders dahin kommen wollen. Ja. Und dann wundert man sich, dass das nicht genutzt wird, ja. Das muss ja so ein Zufall sein, dass du genau dann ankommen musst, wenn zufälligerweise auch mal ein Zug zu dem Zeitpunkt dort ankommt.
day.
Jetzt habe ich die
At
falsche
least
Taste genommen.
they
So.
do have Communauto, a local car sharing program. But since we weren't members, we had to rent a car to get to Val David, which was about as much fun as you'd expect it to be. Val David used to have a train station, which is now a cycling path that is quite well used. But like almost all of these rails to trails projects in North America, this would have more value if it were still a train station connected to Montreal. Outside of Montreal, we encountered the same awful car-dependent places like anywhere else in Canada. But in the end, we did meet up with this person. I never ended up meeting up with this person as we couldn't make the timing work with public transit. And as for this person, we agreed to meet halfway. He would drive, and I would take the subway. We agreed to meet at the Orange Julep, a classic boomer-era burger joint. So I took the metro out to Namur Station. The station era burger joint.
Das ist ja auch Horror. Das ist ja furchtbar. Warum sollte man da hingehen und was essen? Was will man da? Wozu soll ich da hinfahren? Da kann ich ja wirklich nur was essen oder trinken gehen, irgendwie. In diesem Burgerlokal. Was essen gehen, irgendwie, wenn ich sowieso mit dem Auto gerade dran vorbeifahre. Aber ansonsten, wer will da hin? Was will ich hier? Hier ist nichts. Gruselig. Absolut gruselig.
So I took the metro out to Namur Station. The station itself was opened in the 1980s and had some pretty interesting artwork. Neat. But then I stepped outside.
Oh.
Holy shit!
Ja.
I have taken public transit in literally hundreds of cities around the world, and I have never in my life seen the area outside of a metro station that was this bad. Harvey's may make your hamburger a beautiful thing, but a Harvey's parking lot and a literal highway entrance is not a beautiful thing to see when you exit a metro station.
Deswegen, was soll man da? Warum? Wer geht denn da? Ich glaube, das hier ist es, glaube ich. Ne? Das scheint der Burgerladen zu sein da. Warum? Das ist doch Horror.
To get to the restaurant, less than 300 meters away, I had to cross a 4-lane one-way strode, a 6-lane highway, and another 4-lane one-way strode. There were thousands of cars. It was loud and polluted, and it was an extremely uncomfortable place to be outside of a car. It amazes me that this subway station has been open for 40 years, and the land use around it is still this bad. And this is not the suburbs of Montreal. This location is less than 7 kilometers from downtown and well within the center of the island, which is pretty wild. I think you can understand what I mean when I say that good urbanism drops off really fast in Montreal. But hey, at least I got to eat in a restaurant shaped like an orange.
Vollkommen hässlich. Ein hässliches Restaurant in einer hässlichen Gegend, wo ich nicht weiß, warum da irgendjemand mit der U-Bahn überhaupt hinfahren wollen würde. Was will ich denn da? Sprachlos.
I mentioned earlier that Montreal is split into several political regions, which gives them that sweet, sweet local governance. But the flip side is that there are many boroughs and cities which don't want to or can't build proper infrastructure, and that's where a lot of these drastic differences come from. If the bike lane suddenly ends, it's probably because you crossed into a new borough or city. I took a trip out to East Montreal, and I could see the infrastructure getting worse every time I crossed the border into a new borough. The streets out here are very wide and there are lots of cars. And if there's any bike infrastructure at all, it's pretty awful. They do have more missing middle housing than most Canadian neighborhoods, but it's still very, very car-centric.
Schon mal ein Anfang. Jetzt noch einen kleinen Laden unten rein.
Transit service is pretty patchy here, so I got stuck and ended up taking a taxi back to the city. Another independent city is Westmount. Despite being on the island and surrounded by Montreal, Westmount is an English-speaking enclave that's its own city, with lots of large, historic, single-family homes. There's no subway station within Westmount, but there are buses. Westmount also has this nice bike path, but I made the mistake of trying to ride down their main strode, and it was not fun. I decided it was safer to pull over and walk. Now, not everyone in Westmount is insanely wealthy. This poor guy is so hard up, he needs to hand wash his own Maserati. And there are a few bike paths, but for the most part it's kept pretty car-centric. But it's still better than the neighboring Côte des Neiges, who voted to remove a bike lane in 2020 and then hired consultants to spend $150,000 on an exhaustive study to put it back, just for the study. Like, the entire f***ing project shouldn't cost that much.
Ja, das wäre jetzt wieder ein Fall für Extra 3 irgendwie, wenn es in Deutschland wäre, aber naja, gut, kann man natürlich so machen. Ja, Paul, ja, genau. Also genau so ist es, wenn zwei gleichartige Straßen sich kreuzen und es keine gesonderte Vorfahrtsregelung durch Schilder gibt, im Grunde. Das ist jetzt sehr einfach erklärt, ne? Dann haben wir das rechts vor links. Oft in Tempo 30er-Zonen ist generell rechts vor links, außer es ist anders beschildert. Und auch ansonsten, wenn zwei gleichartige Straßen aufeinandertreffen und es keine Schilder gibt, die eine Vorfahrtsregelung vorgeben, dann hast du im Grunde rechts vor links. Genau. Wer von rechts kommt, darf zuerst.
So I guess the trick with Montreal is to live in a neighborhood that's wealthy enough to have people who will advocate for better urban infrastructure, while not being so wealthy that they advocate against it. I also visited some of the suburbs of Montreal, but they were not good. They were pretty much exactly the same as everywhere else in Canada. They do have these wacky horizontal traffic lights, though. And there is more missing middle housing than is typical outside of Quebec. Occasionally, I found some multi-use paths that were decent, but giant parking lots and giant stroads are the norm here. This is typical Canadian car-dependent suburbia. I had to take several taxis because I got stranded by public transit, and it was generally a waste of my time. For example, I made the mistake of trying to take an EXO train, but I got stuck out in suburbia, at a train station with a highway on one side and a giant parking lot on the other. Silly me for thinking a regional train might, go to the city during the day. EXO is a typical commuter rail system that is basically only useful for suburbanites to come into the city for work. I've made a previous video about these ridiculous systems, so I won't expand on that further. At first, I thought maybe I could walk around for a bit and film the suburb, but the stroad right outside the train station had no sidewalk, and I wasn't willing to risk my life for more footage of shitty Canadian suburbs.
Ja,
so again,
ich glaube, da haben wir auch genug von gesehen mittlerweile, von den absolut gefährlichen Stroads, die kein Mensch eigentlich mag und die keiner mit Sicherheit auch gut finden möchte. Aber vor allem bring dich bloß nicht in Gefahr, indem du dich da an den Seitenrand stellst und dann überrollt wirst.
I took a taxi.
Ja. Und wieder im Auto.
I was impressed, though, that the metro station in the suburb of Longueuil had a lot of buses going to it, and there was a university right next to the metro, with some decent bike parking. Unfortunately, the whole area is literally surrounded by highway interchanges, so it's not much fun getting out of here on foot.
Dieser Kontrast, ne? Dieser Kontrast zwischen den ganzen Einfamilienhäusern hier und diesem, was auch immer das hier alles ist. Und einem Autobahnkreuz neben dem nächsten. Der Lärm, der hier, wenn du hier wohnst, wenn du hier in diesem Bereich wohnst, dieser Lärm, der muss ohrenbetäubend sein. Furchtbar.
I was also surprised by what I didn't see in Montreal. A common trend in great cities are new neighborhoods that are being built to be nearly car-free from the start, such as Houthavens in Amsterdam, Europaplatz in Zurich, or Van Kunsten in Oslo. But even the new downtown neighborhoods I visited in Montreal were still being built to be very car-friendly. This is really disappointing because it's locking in car-centric design for generations.
Yeah.
There's a common situation that exists in North American cities that I call walkable islands. Every city has some nice places. That's not something unique. You can paint a good picture of literally any city if you want, if you pick the right spots. Even fake London has Wortley Village, the Thames Valley Path, this bicycle intersection, and that one block of Dundas Street. But these good places are like islands, small pockets of good urbanism among a sea of stroads, highways, and parking lots. We experienced this in Toronto, where things were pretty good, as long as we didn't leave our little walkable island.
Yep.
And I experienced the same thing in Montreal. Now, to their credit, their walkable islands are bigger than Toronto's, and there are probably more of them too. But let's be clear, those fantastic photos and videos you see from urbanists on YouTube and Shitter are taken on those walkable islands. My travels in Montreal were pretty consistent. Every time I went to one of the places recommended to me, I was seriously impressed. But every time I veered even slightly off script, sometimes even just by a few blocks, I regularly encountered terrible urban places. I stayed in 2 places in Montreal, an apartment near downtown and a hotel in Plateau, Montréal. When I got to my hotel, I thought I had booked the wrong place. Everybody told me that Saint Denis in the Plateau was one of the best streets in the city, but it looked like this. Fortunately, I realized I was just too far south. The good stuff starts here. Now, I'm not going to fault Montreal too much for this. Every city repairing bad car infrastructure will have some streets that have been fixed and others that have not. Still, it was funny that 2 blocks north was this, and 2 blocks south was one of the temporary pedestrianized streets, while my hotel was on this landing strip. Still, it did make me realize that Montreal was not as great as I'd been led to believe, even on the best street in the best neighborhood in the city. The other place I stayed was just around the corner from this street. Now, this is really nice, right? There's this nice big sidewalk with trees and benches and...
Ja, könnte ein bisschen mehr entsiegelt sein, ein bisschen mehr grün, ist alles zugepflastert. Vielleicht ein bisschen mehr, ein paar Beete, Wiese, wäre ganz nett. Aber ansonsten, ja, stimme ich zu.
This provided me with a lovely first impression of the city, so I decided to go for a walk. I walked 1 block south, and this street was not so nice, a wide one-way street with high-speed traffic. It was undergoing construction though, so maybe this will become a bicycle lane? I also noticed that there is a lot of parking in Montreal. If you can't find a spot on the street or in the surface parking lot, don't worry, there's a parking garage right here. It was nice to see at least some of this turned into restaurant seating at least. A short walk farther south though, I hit this terrible stroad, right through the center of downtown. This definitely fits the definition of a car sewer where people on bicycles are squeezed between high-speed cars, and the only transit is buses stuck in traffic. In other words, a typical Canadian city. Okay, 1 more block south was this nice little bump out for pedestrians to make safer crossings. Not bad. And here was a metro station. But then I noticed this sign.
Warum? Ach so, man muss auf dem Gehweg fahren mit dem Fahrrad, weil das zu tief ist, weil man sich den Kopf stößt. Das verstehe ich ja noch. Hier scheint es tiefer zu sein als da. 4,45 Meter ab hier. LKWs müssen hier fahren, weil hier rammen sie dagegen. Traurig genug. Aber raff ich nicht. Bin ich scheinbar zu doof für.
Why were people walking and cycling not allowed on this side of the street? And they're all forced to share this one dingy sidewalk. When I got to the end, I found out why. This is a literal highway entrance. Again, this is not suburbia, this is right near the center of the city. I pulled out my map to find the best way to get out of here. This is not how I expected this walk to go. I told my phone to take me to the train station, assuming it must get better from here, but it didn't. Downtown Montreal is awful. It's full of highway entrances and exits, and giant stroads. And there are still several surface parking lots around too. Look at the size of this sign. This doesn't belong in the middle of downtown. This is one of those brilliant ideas right out of the 1960s. Bulldoze the downtown, build a bunch of highways, and create a central business district for suburbanites. And that is downtown Montreal in a nutshell, a place for suburbanites to come by car. There is no way in hell you would find me cycling on a stroad like this. It's such a shame because you can see some glimpses of the historical walkable city that used to be here before it was bulldozed to build garbage like this. When I visit somewhere, I try to get a realistic view of the whole.
Kommt nur mir das so vor oder von Video zu Video zu Video, von Jahr zu Jahr zu Jahr wird auch er immer zynischer und immer sarkastischer und immer, also es werfen mir ja auch einige vor, dass ich auch über die Jahre auch immer sarkastischer und immer zynischer werde. Ist das bei ihm nicht auch so? Wird er nicht auch? Merkt man es an seiner Sprache nicht, dass er immer mehr dahin fällt, mehr Sarkasmus und noch mehr Zynismus da reinzubringen? Oder fällt das nur mir auf?
City. I don't just visit the highlights and call it a day. Of course, this is the internet, so I've still had people accuse me of cherry picking. I remember once laughing and saying, what, do you think if I just turned around, there'd be some giant intersection of 6-lane stroads or something? So funny, except that is literally the case in downtown Montreal. This is a nice little parquet, right? But turn around and sure enough, it's surrounded by 6-lane stroads. Now, I haven't been to Calgary for a while, but I could easily see this being the worst downtown of any major city in Canada. The best part of downtown Montreal is definitely the Old Town, with its historic buildings and cobblestone streets, though it is quite a small part of downtown and still accessible by cars, and to get there, you need to cross this Death Star trench that cuts right through the city center. But for me, Old Montreal was depressing because the rest of downtown probably looked something like this before it was bulldozed. There's also this enormous parking garage right by the waterfront in Old Montreal, which is owned by the provincial government, not the city, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Now, downtown Montreal also has the réseau, or underground city, effectively an underground network of paths connecting adjacent buildings.
Ja, da waren wir auch gewesen, als wir in Montreal waren. Das haben wir auch gesehen. Das war auch sehr spannend.
These exist in a lot of cities with cold weather, such as the Path in downtown Toronto, or the Plus 15 in downtown Calgary. I am not really a fan of these, and someday I should make a video about how these suck the life out of downtown streets. A lot of these pedestrian networks were built in the 1960s and pitched as an escape from the cold, but the primary motivation was to reduce the number of pedestrians on the street so that they didn't interfere with the flow of car traffic.
Ja, das war wirklich ein bisschen strange, als wir da durchgelaufen sind. Das war wirklich, es war merkwürdig. Also es war unangenehm, also ich meine, man erkennt, also wenn man aus Europa kommt, dann sieht man den Sinn auch überhaupt nicht daran, ehrlich gesagt. Aber ja, klar, natürlich, jeder Mensch, der unterirdisch durch Tunnel läuft, steht nicht im Weg, wenn ein Auto durch will.
Personally, I don't think it's a good idea to privatize your downtown and hand it over to a few large property owners. These connected malls span over different skyscrapers owned by different owners, so they are usually maze-like and difficult to understand for infrequent visitors and tourists. And you can see that outside of office hours, this place is a dead zone. These networks are usually only popular with office workers and apparently people who still listen to Metallica. Because of all the winding routes through changing levels between buildings, this underground mall would be extremely difficult to navigate in a wheelchair. I had enough trouble just getting through it with a rolling suitcase. You know what would be a great solution to this? Putting the shops back on the street. I did get to the train station, however. Now, there's something I like to do in every city I visit.
Ah ja, der Hamburger Hauptbahnhof. Schönes Gebäude, drumherum nicht so schön.
And that's what I call the Hauptbahnhof.
Ist sogar relativ neu, dass wir die Aufnahmen. Hier ist schon der rückwärtige Radweg, der angelegt wurde, an der Bushaltestelle vorbei. Ja, also es ist schon. Und der Radweg hier ist auch, ist die Linien sind gemalt worden. Okay, das ist also vergleichsweise aktuelle Aufnahmen.
Station, however. Now, there's something I like to do in every city I visit, and that's what I call the Hauptbahnhof test, because I got the idea in Hamburg.
Die Idee hat er in Hamburg gehabt. Okay. Da bin ich mal gespannt, was ihm da für eine Idee aufgekommen ist.
When you exit the main train station, are you safely and easily able to transfer to surface transit, like here in Basel, or are you immediately confronted by cars and high-speed traffic, like here in Hamburg? Montreal fails this test spectacularly. The train station is effectively hidden. It's surrounded by stroads and almost impossible to find if you're not looking for it. The main entrance is hidden down this smaller side street. And when you go through the front entrance, you get here, a parking lot and a rental car pickup area. I'm pretty sure this is the worst train station entrance I've ever seen, especially since this is the only train station in Montreal. Thankfully, the new REM station is accessible in the train station, but it took me a while to find it because I didn't realize that an R with a line through it meant public transit. I really don't understand why the REM had to be branded differently than the rest of the metro. It seems needlessly confusing. Now, I wanted to take the metro back to my hotel, and theoretically, you can get the metro from the train station. But despite lots of signs for rental cars, it's difficult to find the entrance to the metro. Eventually, I figured out that you walk down this escalator that isn't working, down these stairs and around the corner, through these doors, and then turn right, then down this hallway and another small set of stairs, and then this escalator, which also isn't working, so go down the stairs, a very long set of stairs, then down this hallway and through these doors, and the metro station is right here.
Ist er jetzt schon in der nächsten Stadt oder wo ist er jetzt noch? Ist er noch in Montreal oder hat er schon die Stadt verlassen?
Here on the right. You would really have to be trying to make this transfer any less convenient. But here's where we get to the most insane part of the Montreal Metro, the ticketing system. Most modern metro systems use some kind of smart card, and Montreal has the Opus card. Now, on most metro systems, you load money onto the card and it's deducted when you tap it. And you can set up an auto top-up to add money when you're running low.
Ja, damit starten wir in Hamburg eigentlich auch gerade. Die Prepaid-Card vom Hamburger Verkehrsverbund, auch in aufladbar. Und genau, und ist dann so wie eine Guthabenkarte, die man dann im ÖPNV nutzen kann. Ist letztes Jahr gestartet, dieses Jahr. Dieses Jahr im August, September. Oh Gott, schon so lange her. August, September ist es gestartet. Werden in vielen Supermärkten und Baumärkten verkauft und man kann sie auch dort wieder aufladen. Zum Beispiel bei Rewe oder bei Penny kann man die HVV-Karte dann auch wieder an der Kasse ganz normal wie die Guthabenkarte aufladen. Genau, das ist ein System, was dann entsprechend auch jetzt hier Stück für Stück Einzug hält. Weil wir ab 01.01.2024 das Bargeld bezahlen in Bussen abgeschafft haben. Man muss sich mal vorstellen, dass hier in Hamburg bis vor ein paar Tagen noch mit Bargeld in Bussen Tickets gekauft werden konnten. Und das wurde jetzt abgeschafft und entsprechend dann gibt es jetzt diese Prepaid-Karten-Variante.
Even better, contactless payments with a phone or credit card are available in many cities. Even Toronto does this now, but Montreal is different. Here, you don't load money, you load individual tickets or passes, and the only place you can do that is at a physical ticket machine. This means that there are enormous ticket lines at every metro station. What's worse, even if you have a weekly or monthly pass, you need to load this using the machine, so near the first of every month, the lines are even longer. And to make matters worse, I found many ticket machines were out of order. Even this one at the brand new REM station. And don't even get me started on how bad the land use is around the suburban REM stations. Unfortunately, that's pretty normal for Canadians.
Warum sollte man einzelne Tickets auf eine Karte laden lassen, das man nicht über eine App machen kann, sondern nur an einem Schalter? Wer kommt auf solche Ideen? Wer sitzt da in dem Büro und sagt sich, ja, das ist eine gute Idee. Das machen wir so. Was möchten Sie haben? 4-mal Einzelfahrkarte auf Ihre Guthabenkarte? Ja, einen Moment. Bescheuert.
Canadian transit. Of course, the pedestrianized streets in Montreal were absolutely great, but there are also important caveats here too. These are only temporary. The longest of them is open for about a third of the year, but most of them are open for less than 15 weeks. So if I had visited at almost any time of the year besides summer, I would have missed them. The argument here is winter, which, okay, fine. It doesn't stop Scandinavians from pedestrianizing streets, but Canadians do love to use winter as an excuse. My issue is that because these are temporary, a lot of compromises need to be made. Ultimately, the street needs to turn back into a place for cars, so this limits the design.
Yeah.
For example, wheelchair users rightfully complained that the shops and patios would put displays or seating out that block the sidewalk. So these ramps were installed this year to provide more places to go up and down from the sidewalk level in a wheelchair. This is a great improvement, of course, but if this were a permanent implementation, it could be designed properly so that there isn't any curb at all, like you see in many pedestrianized areas in Europe. Yeah. And these planters are nice, and so is the temporary paint, but ultimately it could be designed to be so much nicer if this were permanent. A permanent street could have proper loading areas and traffic diversions too. Right now, having these flexi sticks everywhere is really ugly. I feel like these pedestrian streets would be so much more impactful and useful if they were 1/10 the length, but permanent.
Ja.
But I assume this temporary situation is all Montreal can get away with politically, and that's understandable. And I don't want to be too negative here because, again, there's no other place in the country that has done a better job than this. But the truth is, the majority of Montreal is not like this. It's more like this. Is this still better than most of the US and Canada? Yes, absolutely. And the city is definitely improving. But I remember sitting on this bus as it slowly trudged through traffic, and I seriously considered titling this video, "The Most Disappointing City I've Ever Visited."
Ja, was macht man ohne einen Weihnachtsmarkt? Das verstehe ich, ja. Also, es gibt doch nichts Besseres, als das im Winter auch zu machen für Weihnachtsmärkte. Dann machst du die Straßen im Sommer zu und nochmal im Winter für den Weihnachtsmarkt. Schon hast du wunderbar die Hälfte des Jahres schon mal das Ding gesperrt.
But that's not really fair to Montreal, because my expectations were just set too high from what I had seen online, and besides, I was saving that title for Philadelphia. I feel like Canadians have been gaslighting me about Montreal. I've been repeatedly told it's just as good as the best European cities, and there's lots of content online suggesting that too. I'm sorry, but these people are just wrong. I spent a week in Montreal, and I traveled extensively throughout the city, and I saw a lot of great things, and some very, very promising improvements. And I cannot stress enough how great these pedestrian streets are. But I also spent over $100 in taxis in a single day, because public transit was so bad outside of the core region. And I ended up in a lot of places where I didn't feel safe walking or cycling, and spent a lot of time stuck in traffic, even on public transit. And all this in what I've been repeatedly told is one of the best cities in North America. Montreal really made me lose interest in making any more videos about US or Canadian cities. It's just not worth the time, cost, and frustration.
Ja, das ist das, was ich ja vorhin auch meinte, was mir auch auffällt, irgendwie, dass er immer sarkastischer und immer mehr, ja, also als würde er desillusioniert werden und weiß gar nicht mehr, warum er überhaupt solche Videos noch macht.
And ultimately, I don't think Montreal is a great city. It's more like 5 good neighborhoods in a trench coat pretending to be a great city. But even I do have to admit, it's still better and improving faster than other Canadian cities, so it does have that going for it. So if you're a Canadian who appreciates good urbanism, someone who doesn't want to spend most of their waking hours surrounded by asphalt or behind the wheel of a car, someone who appreciates human-sized places, and if you're able to find a way to live and work in one of the great walkable islands, then you could really carve out a great life for yourself here in Montreal. Just, don't walk 2 blocks south. The cycling infrastructure, though not perfect, was definitely one of the better parts of Montreal. I did a lot of cycling while I was there, and I only showed a small part of that in this video. So if you'd like to see more, I actually have showed a small part of that in this video.
Aber auch da wieder, ne? Geradeaus, aha, und es endet im Nirgendwo. Ne? Auch da wieder plötzlich aufhörende Radwege.
So if you'd like to see more, I actually have a whole other video with commentary on the rides that I did in Montreal, and it's available now on Nebula. Nebula is the subscription streaming service for educational creators. I release all of my YouTube videos to Nebula early, and you can watch them without any ads or sponsorships. And there are over 150 other creators who are also on Nebula, many of whom you probably already watched today. One of the most important parts to me about Nebula is how we're funded. We're not supported by ads, so your viewing will never be interrupted by an ad break. We're also not funded by venture capitalists who would inevitably enshitify the platform as they extracted the most profit from users. Instead, Nebula is supported by you, the fans who subscribe each month to watch great content. You can also watch Nebula Originals, exclusive content made possible only through funding from Nebula. Like Abigail Thorne's recent stage play The Prince, a project funded by Nebula. If you didn't get a chance to see it while it was playing in London or New York, then you can watch it now on Nebula. Nebula wants to fund more great original content, so for a limited time, Nebula is offering lifetime memberships. For a single payment of $300, you have permanent access as long as you and Nebula exist. A lifetime membership is the best way to support Nebula, to fund new content, and to support the development of new features for the platform. But if that's too much for you, that's fine. Nebula also has monthly and annual memberships. If you sign up using the link go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes, you can get a whole year of Nebula for just $30. That's not $30 per month, that's $30 per year. It's a pretty great deal. If that sounds good to you, then you can find all the relevant links below this video.
Intens, würde ich sagen. Sehr intensiv und ein bisschen desillusionierend. Also ja, scheinbar hat Montreal wirklich schöne Ecken. Aber es ist halt wie in vielen anderen Städten, wie auch in vielen deutschen Städten, dass man für gewisse Sachen, für gewisse Ecken gute Lösungen findet, aber flächendeckend halt immer noch sehr, sehr weit zurück ist. Das haben wir in Deutschland ja auch. Wenn ich in Hamburg unterwegs bin, haben wir auch in Hamburg viele schöne Ecken, die gut gemacht werden, wo man sagen würde, wow, das ist Weltstandard. Und dann geht man, was weiß ich, einen Kilometer weiter und dann denkt man, ach du Heilige, wo bin ich denn hier gelandet? Ja, und weil wir halt dieses flächendeckende gute System oder die flächendeckende gute Infrastruktur einfach nicht haben. Wie sie zum Beispiel mittlerweile die Niederlande hat. Die haben auch mal angefangen und waren wahrscheinlich auch mal in der gleichen Situation wie wir, aber haben das konsequent zügig gemacht und heutzutage hast du kaum Ecken, außer die eine Stadt, in der ich war, die Horror war, hast du ansonsten wirklich durchgehend vernünftige Infrastruktur. Nicht immer gute Infrastruktur, aber vernünftige Infrastruktur.
Do